Beneath the surface of the South China Sea, the water was black and breathless. No moonlight touched the waves, only the slow heartbeat of engines, thousands of men packed inside a Japanese transport, unaware that history was narrowing toward them like the tightening eye of a storm. Above the churning dark, the convoy pressed on its ships, carrying soldier supplies and the lifeblood of a fading empire. Below, in the stillness, an American submarine waited. There was no warning, no silhouette of a pursuer, no sound except the faint hum of machinery far beneath the hulls. This was the quiet terror that sailors came to know as the Silent Death, the unseen hunter that stalked the Japanese merchant fleet across vast Pacific waters. In time, Japanese officers would speak of these attacks with a trembling honesty. It was not combat, it was inevitability. Few weapons in World War II reshaped an entire theater as completely as American submarines, and few campaigns proved as ruthless or as decisive as submarine warfare in the Pacific, where a small invisible force strangled an empire built on sea lanes. What made these hidden hunters the weapon Japanese sailors feared more than anything else? When the Pacific War erupted on December 7th, 1941, the world's attention turned toward the burning wreckage at Pearl Harbor. Yet beneath the surface of the Philippines and the South China Sea, another drama was already unfolding, one far quieter but destined to become decisive. 29 submarines of the Asiatic fleet waited in those waters, their crews exhausted, untested, and unsure of what would come next. Within hours, Admiral Thomas Hart issued an order that would redefine the war unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. From that moment on, every ship within the Japanese merchant fleet troop, transports, tankers, cargo vessels became a legitimate target. But resolve alone could not compensate for reality. Early in the war, American submarines were a blunt weapon. The fleet consisted of just 55 modern boats and a handful of aging S-class hulls, all burdened by a torpedo that failed far more often than it exploded. The Mark 14 ran too deep, its magnetic detonator misfired, and its contact exploder sometimes bent on impact like soft tin. Submarine skippers described the metallic clang of a direct hit that did nothing, a sound so demoralizing they called it the betrayal. This was the fragile beginning of submarine warfare in the Pacific, a campaign launched with courage, but crippled by its own tools. Across the water, Japan felt no need for alarm. The Imperial Navy had trained for clashes of battleships and carriers, not a war against commerce. Their doctrine assumed submarines would attack warships, not the merchant lifelines that fed their empire. Protecting convoys was seen as dull secondary work, hardly worthy of elite officers. Only 47 vessels were assigned to escort duty at the start of the war, a fraction of what would be required. Depth charges were set to explode at 60 feet, unaware that American submarines routinely operated at depths 3 to 5 times greater. And the sonar training and philosophy behind Japanese anti-submarine warfare lagged years behind their Western counterparts. On the surface, the early months offered reassurance. Convoys moved through the Philippines and the South China Sea without significant disruption. Merchant captains believed the ocean's vastness was protection enough. They spoke confidently of outrunning submarines, of how the Silent Death, as it would later be known, posed only a minimal threat. Japanese officers saw no reason to change routes, increase escorts, or rethink doctrine. The sea, after all, had always carried the empire forward. Yet beneath that calm ran the first subtle shifts of a storm. Submariners, frustrated by faulty torpedoes, began performing their own unauthorized tests. Reports flowed to Pearl Harbor, demanding that someone listen. Meanwhile, American codebreakers were working silently in windowless rooms, beginning to penetrate the language of Japanese communications. The industrial might of the United States was gathering, slowly but relentlessly, behind the men patrolling underwater. These early months did not resemble victory. They resembled preparation, the tightening of springs in a weapon not yet fired. The Japanese merchant fleet still sailed with confidence, but the foundations of its destruction were already in motion. Before long, submarine warfare in the Pacific would shift from missed opportunities to merciless precision, and the empire that had underestimated the depths would soon face the cost of ignoring them. By 1943, the long, frustrating apprenticeship of American submarines was finally ending. What had begun as a campaign crippled by faulty torpedoes and timid tactics was transforming into something far more lethal. The turning point came not from a single battle, but from the stubborn persistence of the submariners themselves. Admiral Charles Lockwood, unwilling to accept another failed patrol, ordered tests the bureaucracy had long avoided. Torpedoes were fired beneath fishing nets to prove they ran too deep. Others were shot directly at the volcanic cliffs of Hawaii, where they struck, failed, and then finally detonated only when sinking into deeper water. The evidence was irrefutable. The weapons were at fault, not the men. Once corrected, the Mark 14 became a reliable instrument of destruction. And with that change, submarine warfare in the Pacific shifted into a new phase one in which the hunters finally had teeth. At the same time, new boats rolled off American shipyards each month, manned by crews increasingly seasoned, confident, and aggressive. The cautious skippers of 1942 were replaced by commanders who stalked convoys at night on the surface, driving their submarines like wolves closing in on wounded prey. But the transformation did not end with technology. Intelligence became the quiet multiplier. American cryptanalysts cracked Japanese merchant codes and convoy schedules, allowing submarines to take up positions long before their targets arrived. Convoys that believed they were moving through the vastness of the Pacific were in truth sailing into prepared ambushes. It was a new kind of warfare, one Japanese officers would later describe bitterly, not combat, but slaughter arranged by appointment. The psychological shift among Japanese sailors began with the sinking of the luxury liner Tatsuta Maru lost in just 90 seconds, with nearly 1,000 people aboard. The ship had once carried tourists between Tokyo and San Francisco. Now, it simply vanished beneath the waves, leaving behind only oil debris and the realization that the sea was no longer safe. Then came the tragedy of Montevideo Maru, where over 1,000 Australian prisoners of war died without warning. Another grim reminder that the Pacific had become a graveyard for those dependent on fragile steel hulls. By mid-1943, merchant captains were demanding double pay for voyages through the Luzon Strait. Officers requested transfers ashore. Some sailors refused to board transports at all. The Japanese merchant fleet, once the circulatory system of a vast empire, now felt hunted. They named the unseen threat silent death, a term whispered first in frustration, then in fear, and finally in helpless acceptance. The ocean no longer felt like an ally of Japan's expansion. It felt like a trap. As American submarines gained experience, the pattern became unmistakable. Night attacks on the surface, coordinated strikes by multiple boats, radar-guiding torpedoes into the darkest corners of the sea. Convoys that once sailed confidently now zigzagged across widening routes, adding days or weeks to critical deliveries. None of it mattered. The hunters were waiting. The storm had truly begun, and in its path lay the convoys that would define the most devastating months of the war. By early 1944, the strain on the Japanese merchant fleet was becoming unmistakable. Convoys were vanishing with increasing regularity. Their losses measured not in cargo alone, but in the irreplaceable soldiers meant to defend the farthest edges of the empire. The disaster of the Teichi convoy made this painfully clear. In a matter of days, transports carrying entire divisions were torn apart by American submarines, their decks swallowed by fire, and their holds flooding too quickly for escape. Veteran troops who had survived years of combat in China never reached New Guinea or the Philippines. They died instead in the dark, sealed inside sinking ships. For Japan's high command, it was the first undeniable signal that submarine warfare in the Pacific was no longer a nuisance, it was a strategic collapse in motion. Yet nothing prepared Japan for what came next. On the night of August 18, 1944, convoy HI-71 crept through rough weather in the South China Sea, unaware that multiple American submarines had formed a perfect ambush ahead. The first explosion came from a tanker loaded with gasoline. A column of flame rose nearly 1,000 feet into the night sky, turning the storm clouds orange. Zibum with the teitada. Moments later, torpedoes slammed into the massive transport Teiya Maru. Inside, nearly 5,000 soldiers and civilians were preparing to sleep. The ship rolled, gasped, and began sinking so fast that entire compartments drowned before a single ladder could be climbed. For minutes, that was all. Panic swept the convoy. Escorts fired blindly into the dark. Radar failed to find the attackers. Depth charges fell uselessly into empty water. Above the chaos, only the storm's howl broke the silence beneath it. The silent death moved untouched. More strikes followed. The escort carrier Taiyo erupted into flames when torpedoes ruptured her aviation fuel tanks. A cargo ship carrying ammunition vanished in a detonation so violent that concussions shook the attacking submarine from nearly 2 kilometers away. By dawn, HI-71 had been shattered, 7 ships gone or crippled, more than 8,500 men dead, and not one casualty among the hunters below. 3 months later, the horror repeated itself with convoy HI-81. Another escort carrier, Akitsu Maru, sank in 3 minutes. Mayasan Maru followed, with more than 300-400 soldiers lost. A second carrier, Shinyo, was engulfed in fire and slipped beneath the waves. Reinforcements, meant for the Philippines, arrived with no heavy weapons, no artillery, and no supplies, only exhausted survivors who carried the memory of drowning comrades. By late 1944, submarine warfare in the Pacific had accomplished what Japan feared most, the disintegration of its strategic lifelines. Oil could not reach the home islands. Food shipments collapsed. Factories slowed to a crawl. Entire garrisons starved in silence on bypassed islands, isolated not by distance but by the invisible barricade created by American submarines. The ocean had turned against the empire, and with every convoy lost, the war edged closer to its inevitable end. From the American perspective, the destruction of the Japanese merchant fleet was not simply a wartime success. It was the proof of a strategy that combined intelligence industry and innovation with extraordinary human resilience. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners understood early that Japan's empire depended on the long, fragile arteries stretching from Southeast Asia to the home islands. If those arteries could be severed, Japan's armies would wither, its aircraft would lose fuel, and its fleet would be anchored by necessity rather than choice. American submarines, fewer than 300 in number, became the scalpel for that operation. The results astonished even U.S. commanders. No other campaign in World War II, on land, in the air, or at sea, destroyed an enemy's economic lifeline so thoroughly. In Europe, German U-boats threatened Britain, but never strangled it. Japan's own submarines, though technologically advanced, focused on warships and achieved little against Allied commerce. Only submarine warfare in the Pacific, driven by American cryptanalysis radar superiority wolfpack coordination and relentless patrols, achieved total collapse of an enemy's maritime supply system. Yet the campaign raised difficult questions, questions that echoed long after the war ended. Many Japanese transports carried forced laborers, Allied prisoners of war, and civilians, none of whom were marked by the Japanese according to international conventions. When torpedoes struck these vessels, the losses were catastrophic. US submariners had no way to distinguish troop ships from hell ships, and the ocean, indifferent and merciless, offered no second chances. The tragedy was not intention, but consequence, a reminder that even the most effective strategies carry human costs beyond the battlefield. Globally, the lessons were unmistakable. After 1945, navies around the world reevaluated their doctrines. The United States embraced submarines as a strategic cornerstone, eventually building the nuclear-powered fleet that would dominate the Cold War. The Soviet Union, studying American successes, constructed the largest submarine force on Earth. And Japan, carrying the scars of the silent death, rebuilt its maritime defense around anti-submarine warfare, becoming a leader in sonar and ASW technology. The fear born from those dark waters shaped policy for generations. What emerged from this campaign was more than victory. It was a new understanding of how a modern nation can be undone not by invasion, but by the quiet severing of its lifelines beneath the waves. Japan during the war, carrier groups, bombers, armies advancing across islands, none proved as quietly decisive as the unseen campaign waged by American submarines. Numbers alone cannot fully explain what happened, though they are staggering. More than 1,300 ships, sunk over 5.3 million tons of shipping, destroyed, and tens of thousands of soldiers lost before ever reaching a battlefield. But the true weight of submarine warfare in the Pacific rests on its human cost. Survivors spoke of the torpedo's blow like a thunderclap against iron, of ladders jammed with panicked men, of holds filling so fast that screams turned to silence within minutes. For many, the fear was not of death itself. It was of dying, trapped in a steel tomb, while an invisible enemy slipped away into the dark. That is why Japanese sailors came to call them the Silent Death, not because American submarines struck more brutally than other weapons, but because they struck without warning, without form, without the dignity of battle. A man could fight an aircraft. He could brace himself against gunfire, but he could not fight what he could not see beneath the waves. And yet, in this haunting history, lies a profound lesson. Wars are not won solely by the loudest explosions or the grandest victories. Sometimes they are won by understanding an enemy's lifelines and severing them with precision. Submarine warfare in the Pacific reshaped the very idea of naval power, teaching the world that an empire built on sea lanes can fall silently one ship at a time. For those who study military history, one question remains. What is the greatest lesson we carry from this campaign? The strategy, the technology, or the human cost? If you value these reflections on the past and the stories history nearly forgot, consider joining us as we continue exploring the conflicts that shaped our world. The battles may be over, but the history is still being written.